Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. So today I'll be giving a Dhamma talk on the topic of downsizing, as the title says. So I'll begin by paying homage to the Buddha, and then I'll give some reflections on the Buddha's teachings and how they can be applied. And then I'll take any questions that you might have. So feel free to type in questions at any time during the talk. So I'll start with paying homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. So the topic for this evening is, as the title says, it's downsizing. And the inspiration for this title, so this is the topic Ayasoma assigned to me just a few minutes ago. And the inspiration for this title came from our recent time traveling in Italy, and particularly the period of Tudong practice that we did during that time. And it calls to mind one of the common questions that comes up in Buddhism is people ask, what is letting go? How does one practice letting go? What are the benefits of letting go? And often there's this idea that letting go is this vague, abstract, metaphysical, ultra-spiritual thing which happens entirely within your own mind. But actually, letting go is something very practical and very direct. It's something which we apply directly to the things that we have, the possessions that we have, our relationships, our experiences. And this is something which becomes incredibly clear through Tudong practice. So with this style of practicing, one is wandering from place to place with carrying a bare minimum of possessions and not bringing money, not storing food. So a little bit, there's some similarity to the activity of backpacking. Backpacking is, I guess, a little bit like the layperson's version of Tudong. And the relationship here is that with Tudong practice, as with backpacking, you're carrying everything on your back. So that means you feel every single gram, every single ounce, you feel all of it. And so something, when it's in your own home, you're like, oh, it only weighs 2 or 3 pounds. Well, carry that on your back for a few days, and 2 or 3 pounds starts to feel more like 20 or 30 pounds. And at some point you start to ask yourself, do I really need this? So I remember when I was packing my bag in preparation for going on Tudong, there was the question with each item. It was like, do I really need this? What's the actual bare minimum that I need in order to survive for a few days, walking through the countryside from town to town? And as a monk, it's actually relatively straightforward because you don't need to pack food. Well, for one thing, our rules don't allow us to store food overnight. But also there's no need because every day we do alms round. So all you need to bring then is your alms bowl. Your alms bowl is how you get your food every day. So that simplifies that part. You don't need to worry about carrying food. In Italy, there's public water, drinking water available everywhere. So you don't need to carry too much water. You do need a water bottle. It's pretty basic. And of course, you need something to wear. But again, it's the bare minimum. So what's the actual bare minimum that you need to get by? And as a monk, it's quite simple. You have your basic set of robes, and that's really it. And what else do you need? Again, very little. And this is something which this practice is really good at. So when I came back from Italy, I remember looking at the things that I had left behind, and it's like, well, clearly I don't need these things. I just went for a month without using any of these things, so clearly they're not a necessary part of my life. So then one of the first things I did after I came back was I gave up most of what I had left behind. Because clearly I don't need it. Clearly it's not important. It's just something that was weighing me down. And I didn't have very many things in the first place. But it's that extra step of really asking yourself, what do I actually need? So then this is something where we start to examine our life. We start to examine, first off, in the most simple and direct way, we examine our possessions, the things that we own. And you start asking yourself, if I was walking through the countryside for a few days or a few weeks, would I want to carry this on my back? You start thinking about all your possessions, and you think about piling all your possessions on your back and hauling it as you're walking for 25 kilometers a day, up and down steep hills, narrow trails through the forest. And you're like, do I really want to carry all this stuff on my back for 25 kilometers a day? Do I really need it in order to survive? And you'll find that for most of your things, the answer is no, you don't need it. It's not necessary. So then why is it that it's so difficult for us to let go of these things? What's operating in the mind? And you start to discover the operation of attachment, of grasping, of clinging, how we have something and we don't want to be separated from it. We don't want to be parted from it. And actually, if you have something that you're really attached to, then I recommend creating conditions where you'll be separated from it for an extended period of time. Like if you're really attached to your laptop, well, go on a long international trip and leave your laptop behind. See what it feels like to be completely separated from it for a period of time with no ability to get back in touch with it. For example, in many retreat centers, the moment you arrive at the retreat center, the first thing they do is they confiscate your phone, as well as any other electronic devices you brought with you. That's the first thing they do. And for many people, this is one of the most challenging parts of going on retreat, is they start having phone withdrawals. And many people, they actually don't realize how desperately addicted they are to their phone until it's taken away from them for a few days. But then after the first couple of days of withdrawals, then there starts to have this sense of spaciousness and ease. The sense of like, oh, I actually don't need my phone. And in fact, when I'm not constantly scrolling through Facebook or constantly checking Instagram or endlessly refreshing my emails in the hope that somebody finally replied to that email I sent recently, or whatever it is people do to waste time on their phone. And then you just can't do that for a few days. And you realize, wow, I have so much time. I have so much space. And also the mind starts to relax. We start to realize that the mind was in this constant pursuit of stimulation. And when that stimulation is not available, the mind starts to relax. So there's an initial period of agitation when the stimulation is removed, but then that's followed by relaxation and ease, a sense of openness and settledness in the mind. And it's the same with our, again, all of our possessions. So you think about all the stuff that you have. Well, one of the practices that we have here at the monastery is that we change rooms frequently. So if you come and stay at Empty Cloud Monastery and you're here for more than a month, then you're going to be changing rooms. Every couple of weeks or so, we switch the room assignments around. And that means you have to carry all your stuff from one room to another room, which is not that far. It's just walking a few feet down the hallway. But when you realize you're going back and forth with armloads of junk every time you change rooms, then you start to get the sense of like, oh, I actually have a lot of stuff. And is it really necessary? So trying to get your possessions down to where you can easily transport everything in one go. So that when it's like, okay, Bhante, you've just been moved from that room to that room. It's like, okay, just go and grab your stuff and walk over to the other room and you're done. If you have to take 2 trips, well, now it's starting to become an ordeal. If it's 3 or more trips, oh my gosh, it takes so long. So you start to get a sense of the burden of owning a lot of things. Another aspect of the burden of owning a lot of things is the sense of responsibility that you have towards them. This is especially clear with pets, by the way, because they're sentient beings. So there's the added burden of knowing that there's a sentient being that relies upon you. But even just with ordinary things, if you leave your clothes in the closet for too long, it might get mildewed or it might get attacked by insects. I had a friend who had this fancy designer handbag that she never used, by the way. I never once saw her use it. But she was telling me once that once a month she has to get it out of the closet and like apply leather polish and like check everything to make sure it's in good order. Because if she doesn't maintain it, then it will start decaying. And it's like, I've never once actually seen you use this handbag. But for her, it was this constant subtle stress in the back of her mind of like, must remember to take care of expensive designer handbag or it will fall apart and lose its value. It's like, well, or you could just get rid of it and then you don't have to think about it anymore. That's also a nice solution. So this especially applies to anything which is subject to decay, which, by the way, is everything. It's just some things decay faster than others. Whatever you're holding on to, there's this sense of responsibility to take care of it properly so it doesn't fall apart, so it doesn't decay and disintegrate. So the more things you have, the more persistent burden there is in the back of your mind, the burden of needing to take care of the possessions that you have. So again, really asking yourself, what do you actually need in your life? And what can you reduce? So start giving things away or throwing things away or recycling things. Ask yourself what you have that somebody else would be happy to have and give it away. Especially if it's something that you really cherish. Well, if you don't really need it, then think about who would appreciate it and give it away as a gift. And again, noticing what happens in the mind. So again, when I came back from Italy and I looked at the things that I had left behind, it was like, oh, clearly I don't need these things. So why don't I just get rid of them? Which here in the monastery, it means I just put things back in the general Sangha stores so that any monastic can use them. So whether they're a resident monastic or a visiting monastic, if a monk needs something, then we have things that they can use. So it's not a personal possession of anyone in particular. It's for any monk to use. So most monasteries have this somewhere. They have a storeroom, which is basically it's extra possessions that can be used by any monk in the entire world. So this is one of the interesting things about becoming a Buddhist monk, by the way, is that you're basically joining this global family. And so there's a sense of anywhere you go in the world, you can find family members who will care about you and will make sure you have what you need and make sure that you're getting enough to eat and you have somewhere to sleep and you have robes to wear and medicine and so on. So it's very lovely. So again, most monasteries you'll find somewhere there's a storeroom of extra supplies for monks. So I just went and put all that extra stuff in the monk stores. And there's this sense of ease. It's like, oh, the less stuff I have, the more spacious and happy the mind becomes, which is exactly the opposite of what most people believe. So most people believe the more things they possess, the happier they will be. So this is one of the bases for shopping addiction, for example. It's always thinking, well, if I just get that thing, then I'll be more happy. If I just own the right stuff, then I'll be happy. And clearly, whatever I have is not the right stuff because I'm not happy. So I better buy some more stuff to get more happiness. And of course, it never works. We just keep getting more stuff and still not being happy. So it's like, well, maybe I'm getting the wrong things. I need to try to get different things. And we keep getting different things and we're still not happy. And actually, what just keeps building up in the mind is this sense of agitation and disturbance, this constant quest for the unattainable. Again, this physical renunciation, physical relinquishment, physical letting go is a very important part of our practice. And it then forms the basis for letting go of unnecessary activities and behaviors. So this is a little more challenging. But if you can practice letting go of physical objects, then letting go of physical behaviors and activities becomes a bit easier. Again, we start evaluating, what am I doing with my life? What activities do I routinely engage in? And are these activities things which bring me greater spiritual development? Are these activities which bring me clarity of mind, peace of mind? Are they things which enhance my compassion, enhance my wisdom? Or are they things that just waste time, just ways of filling up time while we wait for death? Is that what our activities are all about? Or perhaps our activities are even counterproductive, things which produce more agitation and disturbance. So I'm actually thinking, when I was a teenager, I used to be addicted to video games, and very common problem. And actually, it's become more and more prevalent over the years. I've noticed these days it's actually a very widespread problem in the developed world. So addiction to video games, and particularly anything which is fast-paced, produces a lot of adrenaline, and it builds up a lot of agitation in the mind. And then that agitation carries through to all of your other activities. The agitation persists in the mind. So that would be something which one could say it's not just wasting time, but it's actually cultivating restlessness and agitation of mind. So it's building up our hindrances, which make meditation practice more difficult. Or any kind of activity which strengthens greed, hatred, or delusion. So again, these are activities which are best avoided because they're actually counterproductive. So they're building up proliferation in the mind. So it's, instead of acquiring peace, happiness, wisdom, and compassion, instead we're acquiring agitation, depression, anxiety, confusion, irritability. So those are the kinds of activities that we need to recognize as poisonous, as counterproductive to our spiritual practice. Another very common one is binge watching TV shows. So when I was a kid, if you wanted to binge watch TV shows, you had to actually go out and buy video cassettes. So, and it was huge. Like, to get like a whole season, you had to get like a bunch of video cassettes. So it was actually quite a bulky thing. And then later on there were DVDs, so you could get like a DVD with one season on it. And nowadays it's really easy. And I've never actually done this, but apparently there's websites where you can actually go and just sit down and just watch Netflix season after season after season of some mindless idiocy. Just burning away hour after hour and hour after hour after hour of your life on something completely useless, completely pointless. And it also just stirs up, again, the mind of proliferation. And it can also build up the mind of delusion. So the more we expose ourselves to non-Dhamma, the more the mind starts to think in terms of non-Dhamma. Again, most entertainment is not centered around the values of Buddhism. Most entertainment is not centered around wisdom and compassion. It's not centered around mindfulness and equanimity. Most entertainment is actually centered around greed, hatred, and delusion. And it involves characters that have serious greed, hatred, and delusion problems. And it involves storylines that glorify greed, hatred, and delusion. And it's built upon principles and values which are fundamentally greed, hatred, and delusion. This applies to 99% of entertainment. So naturally, if we're immersed in that kind of world all the time, what is that going to do to our mind? It's going to mean that then our mind starts to value greed, hatred, and delusion. And this can happen quite insidiously. You might think that you're a good Buddhist, but then you're constantly filling your mind with counter-Buddhist messaging. What do you think is going to happen to your mind? Maybe on a conscious level, you're holding good values, but on a subconscious level, you'll be holding not so good values, possibly even harmful values. So then when we recognize that, those are our activities and experiences to be let go of, to drop from our lives. Just like when you go home and you look at all the useless knickknacks cluttering up your shelves, all the pointless decorations everywhere, you're like, maybe I should get rid of some of this stuff. Or you open your closet and you see that you have 37 pairs of shoes. You're like, maybe 3 pairs of shoes is plenty. I actually only have 2, by the way. So I have 1 pair of sandals and 1 pair of winter boots. That's it. That's actually all you need. I'm willing to allow the possibility of say, athletic shoes. So 3 pairs of shoes. Sandals, boots, athletic shoes. That's it. I can't imagine what else you need in your life. I guess people sometimes dress up for things, but I don't know. Like, to me, my dress-up clothes are exactly the same as my leisure clothes. One of the perks of being a monk, we're always both in our casual attire and in our formal attire at all times. Letting go of activities. Again, this is quite challenging. And so one of the ways we do this is by cultivating wholesome activities. So wholesome activities like sutta study or Buddhist chanting, of course, meditation practice. Wholesome activities like volunteering, doing charity work. This actually is very important. One of the criticisms which is sometimes leveled at the Buddhist world is the paucity of charity programs. So compared to, for example, the Catholic world, Catholicism does one thing extremely well, and that's charitable operations. Buddhism is a little bit behind on that one. That's one thing which we could really step up our game on. So if you find that now that you've let go of binge watching and video games, you just don't know what to do with your time anymore, well, start volunteering at charity organizations or start your own. Get involved with something that makes the world a better place. Put your free time and energy to the betterment of others, and you'll find that also betters yourself. So replacing useless activities with beneficial activities, wholesome activities. And of course, also taking care of your body is also important. So paying attention to the health of the body. So letting go of unhealthy eating habits, cultivating healthy eating habits in that place. So recognizing that the body is an important tool of the mind. So we want to keep it in good condition. Then we can actually get to the point of talking about downsizing the mind. So we always start with the external, and then we move towards the internal. We start with the obvious, and then we move towards the subtle. So at this point, then we can start talking about downsizing the mind. So looking at our mental activities. And just as we looked at our physical activities and our physical possessions, and we asked, well, what do I really need? In the same way, look at your mental activities and ask yourself what you really need. How much of our time is spent thinking about useless things? How much of our time is spent even going in unproductive or unwholesome directions? So definitely things which are unwholesome, again, connected with greed, hatred, and delusion, we should make an active effort to discard that from the mind, toss it out. Just like if you get your bowl of fruit out and you see that there's a moldy piece of fruit in there, then you toss it out. You don't even have to think about it. You just get rid of it. That's the same way when you look at your mind. If you recognize that there's unwholesome mental activities, unwholesome mental objects, then you toss them out, just like a moldy piece of fruit. There's no point in keeping it around. But also examining how much of our mental behaviors are just useless clutter. They're just things that we do to fill up time, things we do to distract ourselves. So starting to drop it. And actually in every moment, constantly watch your mind. And whenever you notice any kind of mental activity, immediately examine it. Is this something which is bringing me genuine benefit? Or is it just wasting time? Is it useless activity? And if you recognize it as useless, then immediately stop participating in that mental activity. Let it die out. And if you have a lot of mental restlessness, your mind wants to keep moving, well, then at least think about the Dhamma. If you want to move your mind, then move it in the course of Dhamma. So doing something productive. Or do metta. Start repeating metta phrases in your mind. If you want to think, well, that's actually a very wholesome way of thinking. Mantra practice. This is another place where it's very useful, is when you're dealing with a lot of mental restlessness, the urge to do something with the mind. Well, then you can repeat a mantra, Buddhist mantra. Again, that can be a very good way of redirecting that mental restlessness. And of course, looking at our emotional habits. So what kinds of emotional states are we nurturing within ourselves? And what are we holding on to? Often we get into patterns of emotional behaviors, patterns of nurturing and feeding certain emotions in the mind, which are, again, either blatantly counterproductive in the sense that they make us more agitated, more disturbed, more depressed, more angry, or they're just useless. It doesn't bring us any benefit. It just keeps us going in circles. So then as soon as we recognize those kinds of emotional behaviors, we should discard them immediately. So recognize them for what they are and let them flow through the mind without sticking. So not participating in them, not getting involved in them. Just let them fade away on their own. And actively cultivating wholesome emotional behaviors. Again, loving kindness is the classic example. It's one of the most wholesome emotions you can deliberately generate. And then we start getting into deeper layers, self-identities. Who is it that we think we are? So often we have identities like I am clever, or I am stupid, or I am young, I am old, I am funny, I am boring. Like we have these kinds of identities. Well, self-identities are all nonsense. You're not anything. You are who you choose to be in this moment. So maybe you have memories of in the past, you said some funny things, but that doesn't mean you're a funny person. It just means you have memories of having said funny things in the past. That's literally all it means. You are not funny. But there is a memory of having said something funny at some point in the past. There's an important distinction there. Similarly, you might think that you're stupid. Well, not necessarily. You probably have memories of having the experience of stupidity in the past, but well, That's the past. What's the experience right now? Or actually, you might have the opposite experience. Like, I actually remember when I was younger, I think I was more intelligent when I was younger. And actually got a little bit stupider over the years. So I remember this past identity, this identity I had in my mind of like, oh, I'm such a smart person. But then the years go by and it's like, well, maybe that identity wasn't actually true. Maybe it was just an experience that I had. And was it even true at the time? Or was it just a distorted self-perception? And ultimately, it doesn't matter. Because when you relinquish self-identities, then you can actually open up to just being aware of what's going on right now. Actually, if you have the identity of like, oh, I'm the funny person, the entertaining person, the clever person, well, then you'll feel obligated to always be entertaining and funny and clever. But actually, if you don't have any self-identity around these things, then you can just meet each moment on its own terms and respond appropriately to each moment without feeling obligated to live up to or inhabit a particular self-identity. Similarly with gender. So we say, oh, I'm a man, I'm a woman, I'm non-binary, I'm transgender, I'm this, I'm that. Well, you can say you are whatever you want to say you are, but all of it is utter fiction. It's all complete nonsense. You're not anything. What does it mean to be male? What does it mean to be female? What does it mean to be non-binary? What does it mean to be transgender? Like, what do these things actually mean? It doesn't mean anything. The mind is not male. The mind is not female. The mind is not transgender. The mind is not anything. So we have this arbitrary list of adjectives for male, this arbitrary list of adjectives for female, and this arbitrary list of adjectives for non-binary, and this arbitrary list of adjectives for every other category you can think of. But ultimately, that's all it is. It's just an arbitrary list of adjectives, and it varies from person to person and culture to culture and time to time, place to place. None of it's solid and none of it's set. None of it's real. So similarly, if we start imposing these list of adjectives on ourselves, it's like, oh, I'm a man, therefore I better act manly. Well, how horrible is that? Or like, oh, I'm a woman, I need to act womanly. Well, how horrible is that? How about you just respond appropriately to the present moment? Respond with whatever is most wholesome and relevant to that moment. You don't need to do what a man is supposed to do. You don't need to do what a woman is supposed to do. You don't need to do anything at all except respond appropriately to the present moment to apply the most wholesome response. It doesn't matter what you think a man or a woman is supposed to do. Similarly, it doesn't matter whether you think you're American or Italian or Mexican or African or whatever. It doesn't matter the slightest bit, because all of that is also arbitrary nonsense. So you can drop all of these self-identities. They don't mean anything at all. All they are is mental clutter. All they are is arbitrary self-restriction. So just toss it all. It's useless. You don't need it. It's not helpful. It doesn't bring any benefit to you. And then, of course, the deepest layer of letting go is letting go of the sense of self. So we have specific self-identities, such as I am male, I am American, and so on. I am tall, I am pale. Like, we have all these arbitrary specifics. But then the generalized self-identity is just I am. So I exist. There is some individual separate being called me. And this is the deepest layer of letting go. And this is actually the culmination of Buddhist practice. So most of us are nowhere near this point. Most of us are nowhere near the point of relinquishing the core concept of self-existence, which in Pali is called asmi mana. So asmi means I am or I exist, and mana means the concept. So asmi mana is the concept of self-existence, the concept I am. So this is the most fundamental acquisition of mind, possession of mind, that ultimately needs to be downsized and discarded. But we start with the basics. Again, walk in your room, look at the stuff you have, and ask yourself, how much of this do I really need? And the answer is very little of it. Most of it you don't really need. So start getting rid of stuff, giving it away. And then again, going through your activities, start considering, what do you do with your time? How do you engage your body and mind? And ask yourself, what can be discarded? What's really not necessary? How can you cultivate wholesome things instead? And again, looking at self-identities. Where do we have a rigid self-identity? Where have we solidified a story about who we're supposed to be or what we're supposed to be? And starting to discard that. That's also useless. And all of this prepares the way for this deepest layer of letting go. So letting go of asmimana, discarding this core conceptualization, this core concept of I am, I exist. So I think that's all I have to say on the topic, at least for now. So we can end with 3 sadhus, and I'll go ahead and take some questions. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. So I see a number of people checking in. So hello to Sud, Jevli, Dio, Gita, Miguel, Vivian, Ana Maria, Janaki, Charles Lee, Shihan, Jayanta, Tora, Karen, Jojo, Mary, Anthony, Marielle, Kristen, Niranjan, Amaranta, and Cindy. Great, good to see all of you. See lots of familiar names. And I also see a few questions. So Jojo says, I feel like sati seems like the mechanism that will help me let go of plenty and be content of less. To start, should I label phenomena like things I am attached to? Or should I just use that sati to remind myself to stay present and be glued to the present moment and eventually become more mindful? Should I label or not during sitting meditation and during life? Well, of course, mindfulness is critical in the sense of constantly being aware of body and mind at all times, constantly being aware of activities that we're engaging in, so activities of body and mind. As for whether noting is useful, well, is it useful for you? I don't personally find it particularly useful for me, but I know many people for whom it's very useful. And actually, I occasionally use it at times when I feel like it's relevant to the present conditions of mind. So it's a tool which is useful at some times and not useful at other times. So it's important to develop enough self-awareness and wisdom to know when to use the right tool. Yeah, most of the way you develop this wisdom is through experimentation, trying out different methods and seeing how it affects the mind. So labeling, noting, sometimes it's really helpful and sometimes it's counterproductive. So see what happens. And of course, staying present, well, actually one of the best ways to stay present is to always focus on your body. One of the downsides of labeling is that it's a mental activity. So it can draw attention away from our physical experience. So again, notice what's going on. Is it actually helping you pay attention to your physical experience? Or is it drawing attention away from your body? So see what's going on there. Actually, one of the best ways to stay present is mindfulness of your feet. It really transformed my practice when about a dozen years ago, a monk told me to, I still remember this, he said, everyone talks about mindfulness of breathing, but nobody talks about mindfulness of feet. I still remember him saying this, and yeah, really revolutionized how I was approaching mindfulness practice. Just feel your feet as you go throughout your day. And it's amazing how much that will change your experience of life. As for letting go, again, yeah, of course, mindfulness will help you let go, but start with letting go of physical things. And then start letting go of coarse physical activities. Then you can start working on letting go of mental activities. And that's where sharp sati is really critical. You have to have a clear awareness of your own mind in order to let go of anything. This is also where a good foundation of sila, morality, following precepts and practicing kindness, makes a huge difference, because in order to follow precepts, in order to practice morality, you need to have some awareness of mind. So it helps to cultivate an awareness of your own mind, and also an ability to distinguish wholesome and unwholesome mind states. Then we have a question from Kristen. Kristen says, I have been working on getting rid of things. That's great. It doesn't take much work. You just get rid of things. She says, but I'm a bit caught up on the guilt of having acquired the thing in the first place. How do you advise we work with this emotion? More metta? I mean, metta never hurts. And metta is always helpful. And any kind of aversive mind state, metta will help. So guilt is actually a form of self-hatred. So that is something which can be addressed by cultivating more metta. But also, it's important to practice self-forgiveness. And in this context, I mean, recognizing that you have this memory of this foolish person who made a foolish decision. Okay. So there's a story of someone who's not enlightened who did something unenlightened. Okay, it's totally understandable. And now we have the experience of trying to be a little bit more wise than the person in this story. That's great. This all sounds really good. So there's no basis for guilt. If you identify as the person in your memories, then yeah, that's pretty uncomfortable. But you're not the person in your memories. You are whatever you're doing right now. So you have a memory of this person who bought 37 pairs of shoes last year. But right now, you're the person who's giving away her extra shoes to other people. Oh, that's great. So focus on that. And it's like, well, yeah, of course, there are people in the world who buy too many things. Yeah, facts. Just don't be that person now. And recognize that when people are caught up in greed, hatred, and delusion, then they make poor decisions. So have some compassion for your past self, who made some not so good decisions. Cindy says, I spent today downsizing material things before I knew this was a topic today. That's great. Yeah. Keep it up. Sheehan asks, can downsizing ever go too far? If so, can you give me an example? Yes. So in the time of the Buddha, and they actually still exist to this day in India, but there's very few anymore. They were much more common back in the day. So in the time of the Buddha, there were the so-called naked ascetics, people who literally got rid of absolutely every physical possession to the point where they didn't even have clothes. That's going too far. And Magma asks, I'm a very beginner at meditating. Well, congratulations on starting. We all start at some point. And through the process of learning and practicing and experimenting, then you get more understanding, and usually you get better over time. So there's no shame in being a beginner, because everyone is a beginner at some point. And beginning is necessary. So I'm happy that you're beginning. So they say, I'm a very beginner at meditating and wanted to ask what the difference between observing thoughts versus observing and stopping thoughts is. Well, with observing thoughts, you're watching them. You're watching thoughts as they pass through the mind. Stopping thoughts means that you're actively stopping thoughts. So that's the difference. So I'm not really sure what your question here is, because the answer seems to already be in the question. But usually when you observe thoughts without actively participating in them, they'll usually evaporate on their own very quickly. Thoughts, most of the strength that thoughts have comes through our participation. So many of the thoughts and mental objects that appear in the mind are appearing of their own accord. But if we don't get involved in them, they'll have very little strength, and they'll usually disappear very quickly. And actually, if a mental object is persisting in the mind, then that's usually a sign that we're fueling it. We're keeping it around. So then that's where we need to look more closely. What am I doing? Is this something that I am holding on to, something that I am nourishing? And if so, how can I let it go? And sometimes it's just a matter of deliberately redirecting the mind to something else. Yeah, I mean, often with thoughts, it's actually because we're attached to thoughts in the same way that we're attached to our possessions. So a thought appears in the mind and we're like, ooh, I really like this one. I don't want it to go away. Or sometimes it's like, I really hate this thought, and my self-identity is built around hating this thought. So I need to keep actively hating this thought. So that's also a form of clinging. It's clinging to hating things. And that also will keep it around in your mind, which is ultimately counterproductive. And Amranta says, I'm going to start doing what you suggest about things. Meanwhile, I've been trying to close some old tasks of my job to change my orientation to a life less academic. Yeah, I mean, whatever is helpful to you. Again, it's asking, what can I do to live a more wholesome life? A life more in line with the Buddha's teachings. So Sud says, are you suggesting gender isn't real, but there is a clear physical difference between male and female in humans? So this is making a distinction between gender as a form of identity versus physical sexual characteristics. So of course, there are physical sexual characteristics which vary between male and female physical forms. But when we're talking about gender, we're talking about a mental construct. So there's our internal mental construct, like what does it mean to be male, or what does it mean to be female? And there's also the external constructs, so the cultural conditioning, societal expectations, and so on. So all of this together creates an abstract mental concept of gender. And that's just a trap. It doesn't mean anything. And also, it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with your body. So you might have a male body, but find that actually your preferred ways of thinking, feeling, acting, speaking, and behaving are more in line with what society calls female, or vice versa. So what does it mean? What do we mean when we talk about our gender? And why do we arbitrarily assume that having a certain body means that you have to act in certain ways and feel in certain ways and think in certain ways and talk in certain ways? Again, it's totally arbitrary. It's just locking ourselves into a box, which doesn't make any sense. And Amaranta asks, what is the difference between asmi mana and sakkaya ditthi? So asmi mana, that's A-S-M-I, M long A-N-A. So asmi mana. So sakkaya ditthi is the coarser, more obvious form of self-identity. So it's specific self-identity. It's usually defined in the text as believing I am the five khandhas. So I am this body, I am these sensations, I am these perceptions, I am these thoughts, I am these forms of consciousness. So specific identity. Whereas asmi mana is just a generalized sense of self-existence, not tied to anything in specific. Then Magma says, I guess my original question was, why observe thoughts if a lot of them are negative? But you've answered that with the idea that they will dissipate after being observed. Yeah, and also through observing our thoughts, we can start to recognize what is harmful and what's actually beneficial. So Buddhist practice is not about letting go of all thoughts, but actually much of our practice is about deliberately cultivating wholesome mental activities while deliberately discarding unwholesome mental activities. So there is also the practice of letting go of thinking entirely, and that has its place as well. But there is the practice of deliberately cultivating wholesome mental behaviors, which often is for many people, it's actually much easier and more practical. And Corinne says, I'm wondering if you could say more about letting go of labels, in particular those that we commonly use to describe our identities. How can we understand these labels and let go of them? Well, one thing that you might start with is to just start asking yourself, how would I describe myself? Or how do I perceive myself? And maybe you can start writing down a list. And then go through the list and ask yourself, but is this absolutely, completely, permanently true? Have I always been like this and always will be like this? Does this actually inseparably define who I really ultimately am? For example, if you write down, I am an angry person, well, ask yourself, have I always been angry? Every single moment that I can ever remember, have I always been angry? Oh, no. Actually, I'm only angry a small fraction of the time. Am I currently angry? No, not particularly, no. Will I always be angry in the future? Probably not. I guess I'm not an angry person. I guess that's actually a fake identity. It's not real. There are times when anger is present, but that's actually not who I really ultimately am. So you can go through all of your identities like this. Go through everything that you think defines you, all the labels that you think describe you, and ask yourself, is that really ultimately, permanently, limitlessly true? And Jojo says, physical gender is real, but doesn't define who we are, right? Mind is genderless, much like the great Brahmas who are free of a gross material body, which divides into two genders. So, I'm actually really not the best person because in the years that I've been a monk, there's been this whole advance in the academic field of gender studies, and I haven't taken any of those university courses which would be necessary in order to use the right terminology in the right way. So actually, if I get too deep into these topics, I'm going to start annoying the people who actually do have university degrees in gender studies, and they'll come and argue that I'm using the terms incorrectly. So just advance warning. When I talk about these things, I'm not talking from the perspective of a university graduate in gender studies. I'm strictly talking from the perspective of a Buddhist monk who knows what the Buddha taught, or tries to know what the Buddha taught anyway. So as I was saying earlier, it's very important to distinguish between the physical body and our mental constructs. So the body is the way it is, or is the way it appears to be anyway. But that doesn't have anything to do with our mental constructs. So I wouldn't actually say physical gender is real, because saying anything is real gets into really dangerous ontological territory, as you can't really say anything is real in an ultimate sense. But you can say that the body seems to be more real than the mind. But from another perspective, you can also say that the body is just an image appearing in the mind. So the body then is no more real than any other mental object. So it's important not to get too caught up on the body. What is the body? Ultimately, it's just an experience in the mind. I do agree with you that mind is genderless. Ultimately, the mind itself has no gender. I definitely agree on that. And you mentioned the great Brahmas who have no material body and therefore no gender. That applies in the very highest heaven realms. The very highest heaven realms, there's no gender. There's no distinction of male and female. That only exists in the more coarse realms of existence. And Kumu says, isn't it so that in addition to identities made by us, others around us also give us plenty? Oh, yes, they certainly do. She says, we are just loaded with all kinds of identities we have to get rid of and not pay any attention. Yeah, I mean, basically, the people around you have all of their own ideas about what you are and who you are. But that's their problem. It's not your problem. And you can't live your life trying to match everybody else's identities about you. And that's just a nightmare. I mean, dealing with our own identities is enough of a nightmare. And you want to pile on everybody else's identities about you. Way too complicated. So our only responsibility is to try to follow the Buddha's teachings. That's all. Our only responsibility is to exemplify the wisdom and compassion of the Buddhas as best we can. That's all. And as for what identities other people have about us, well, that's their problem. So yeah, we shouldn't believe what other people think we are. And we definitely shouldn't try to live up to other people's identities and expectations about us. What we should do is try to live up to the Buddha's expectations about us. Which is that every single one of us has the capacity for complete enlightenment. Every single one of us has the capacity for perfect wisdom and compassion. That's what we should be trying to live up to. It doesn't matter. So somebody else says like, oh, you're female, therefore you should have long hair and speak in a soft voice. It's like, well, no. That doesn't have anything to do with liberation. It doesn't have anything to do with wisdom and compassion. So I'll speak however I want, and my hair will be whatever length I want it to be, because that doesn't have anything to do with anything important. So if somebody else wants to impose their identities onto you, well, that person is just generating suffering for themselves. So that doesn't affect you in any way, except that it's another basis for compassion. It's like, oh, this poor person is expecting me to be a particular way. Well, that's going to cause them suffering because expectations always lead to suffering. So too bad for them. But there's not always that much we can do to help others. We try, but ultimately it's up to each person to work out their own issues in their own mind. That's the last of the questions from online. Do you have any questions? No? So that seems to be the end of questions for the evening. So we can go ahead and end with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you next time.